And welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. For 2 days following the crash of the Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in eastern Ukraine, corpses still litter the ground. Finally, the bodies were bagged up and piled on a train by masked, hooded men. It was a crime scene run by the criminals. The very outlaws who committed the crimes controlled the area. Evidence indicates that Russian separatists trained by the Russian military used a sophisticated Russian anti-aircraft missile system to shoot down the flight MH17. In the weeks preceding the event, Ukrainian separatists had been receiving a lot of new gadgets from Uncle Vladimir. On Face the Nation, Secretary of State John Kerry said that a few weeks ago, U.S. intelligence watched a 150-vehicle convoy coming from Russia going into the east of Ukraine with tanks, artillery, multiple rocket launchers, armored personnel carriers turned over to the separatists. Included was at least one SA-11 surface-to-air missile launching system. Kerry said, "We know they had an SA-11 right in the vicinity hours before this shoot. We know that the separatists have shot down 12 aircraft in the last couple of months, among them 2 transport planes. We have video of a standard SA-11 mobile missile system driving across the borders into Russia about 4 hours after the Malaysian flight was shot down. The vehicle had 2 SA-11 missiles missing. To be accurate, the separatists apparently did not understand what kind of plane they were shooting at this time." Colonel Igor Strelkov calls himself the military commander of the People's Republic of Donetsk. On his website, Strelkov announced the shooting of a plane moments after Flight 17 went down. In the Torets region, they have destroyed an AN-26 transport plane. Its wreckage landed near the Progress mine. This will teach them, do not fly in our skies. The bird fell on open fields. It did not damage inhabited sectors. Peaceful people did not suffer. But it was not a transport plane, and peaceful people did suffer. 295 of them and their families and loved ones. A few minutes later, the rebels realized what they had done. Strelkov deleted his post about downing the plane. Other rebels radioed their masters in Russia to find out what to do next. They did not know that the Ukrainian government was monitoring the call and would send it to YouTube, in effect giving it to the world. It has since been verified by U.S. intelligence. A Russian official asked, "Well, what do you have there?" The separatist replies, "In short, it was 100% a passenger aircraft." The Russians ask, "Is there anything left of the weapon?" The separatists, "Absolutely nothing. Civilian items, medical stuff, towels, toilet paper." A second separatist interrupts, "There are a lot of corpses of women and children." From this, it's obvious that the separatists shot down the plane and that Russia was complicit. Russia gave weapons to the thugs, then showed them how to use those weapons. This could have enormous repercussions on the world. Before the shooting, Russia was already having a tough time recruiting separatist fighters in the Ukraine. They were losing battles. In recent weeks, the Ukrainian government had seized back half of the land previously taken by the rebels. In response, Russia had been sending more arms and more special forces into the Ukraine, and they had been massing more troops on the border. Since the shoot-down, Russia has been pulling people and weapons out of Ukraine. Putin may decide that the eastern Ukraine is not worth the trouble, or he may just be pulling back until things cool down. I suspect he will continue his effort to rebuild the old Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, a sphere of influence that more and more mirrors the coalition of nations described in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. If Europe and the United States further isolate Putin, it may push him to go ahead with plans already in the works to make a multi-billion-dollar trade agreement with Iran. Russia would receive Iranian oil in exchange for goods and services, including the nuclear equipment and know-how. This would make both Russia and Iran less vulnerable to Western sanctions and more dangerous in every way to Israel and the Western world, just as the prophets predicted. As I prepared for this week's program, I was again struck by the speed with which events are moving into the scenario the prophets predicted for the end times. I believe we're there. People on the street are talking about what all of these things mean. Folks that wouldn't darken the door of a church or pick up a Bible are now very curious. This may be our greatest opportunity, maybe even our last opportunity, to share the gospel of Jesus Christ before we're silenced by political correctness. The message that God has given me is more important now than it's ever been, for the church and for the nation. That's why I'm asking you to help me to expand our reach.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
And thanks for being a vital part of my team. Israel's conflict against Hamas, known as Operation Protective Edge, has escalated dramatically in recent days. Last weekend, 13 soldiers from an elite Israeli Defense Forces unit were killed during an operation to eliminate Hamas' network of underground tunnels. 2 of the casualties were also American citizens serving in the Israeli army. Gary Bauer observed that proportionately it would be the equivalent of 500 U.S. soldiers being killed in one battle. Last week, I noted that more than 1,000 rockets had been raining down on Israel from Gaza in just the previous 2 weeks. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that the greater danger may be found in the complex of terror tunnels that Hamas had constructed in Gaza over the last few years. There are dozens of these incredibly sophisticated tunnels. They are strengthened with reinforced concrete, fortified, and some dug as deep as 100 feet. Some of them originate beneath apartment buildings in the middle of Gaza. Some open up underneath mosques. One senior IDF officer described the tunnels as almost entirely hidden on the surface and as elaborate as a labyrinth. The recent fighting has been particularly fierce because apparently the IDF was getting close to discovering a nexus of the tunnel complex in a suburb outside Gaza City. Hamas is desperate to protect these tunnels, so they threw everything they had at the Israelis. We've known for years that Hamas has used tunnels between Gaza and Egypt to smuggle in weapons and rockets and to smuggle people out. Israel has routinely destroyed these tunnels upon discovery, but these are tunnels of different caliber and purpose. Hamas fighters use the tunnels to move from Gaza into Israel to ambush and, if they can, kidnap Israeli soldiers. Many observers fear that Hamas is planning to use the tunnels to launch major terror attacks inside Israel. Israeli soldiers thwarted at least 2 such attacks early in this week. One party included 13 terrorists. Early in the week, Israel had already located 14 tunnels into Israel with almost 40 access points. It's critical to remember that even though Hamas, Gaza is only a quasi-state, it is still a formidable enemy. The simple fact that Hamas denies Israel's right to exist and is fully committed to the point of death to the absolute annihilation of Israel makes it even more lethal. It has the backing of several terrorist-supporting nations that supplied it with funds as well as highly developed rockets, missiles, mortars, and other weapons. It has received hundreds of millions of dollars from the West, which it has used to develop its arsenals and fortify infrastructure. Add to the mix that it feels no need to observe globally accepted conventions of war, and in many ways, fighting Hamas becomes even more dangerous than fighting an established state. Pile on the top of this the fact that the vast majority of the world's media refuses to communicate the truth and instead regurgitates Hamas propaganda, and it's easy to see that Israel is fighting for its life on several fronts. For instance, one internet headline reads, "Israel kills for the fun of it. Their foreign military policy equals pure sadism." The writer of the article, labeled Operation Protective Edge, just one example of a general policy of terror carried out by the Israelis against the people of Gaza. He's right about one thing. This is an example of terrorism against the people of Gaza, but not from the Israelis, rather from Hamas. Even the New York Times, with its anti-Israel bent, acknowledges that the militants of Hamas and its affiliates fire rockets into Israel with little regard for how the response affects Gazans. The United Nations, which is no friend of Israel, says they found 20 rockets in a school they run in Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency said in a statement, UNRWA strongly condemns the group of groups responsible for placing the weapons in one of its installations. This is a flagrant violation of the inviolability of its premises under international law. While the UN sees it as a violation of the inviolable, Hamas sees it as a standard operating procedure. Hamas is willing to hide behind women and children, behind the sick and the elderly. The hate-filled Hamas agenda reveals itself most clearly in the shameful disregard for the people it claims to protect. Egypt tried to broker a ceasefire. Israel immediately accepted their proposal, but Hamas refused. Hamas spokesman Hossam Badran said to accept the Egyptian ceasefire would be the same as surrender to Israel. This again raises the question, with their lives being daily devoured by Hamas malevolence, why do the inhabitants of Gaza continue to vote for Hamas at every opportunity? Well, it's probably because of decades of indoctrination of their children in hating Israel. And it seems that whoever is most aggressive against Israel is the one you vote for, no matter what else they're guilty of. Human Rights Watch is a well-known rights advocacy group. It issued this statement: Israeli air attacks in Gaza investigated by Human Rights Watch have been targeting apparent civilian structures and killing civilians in violation of the laws of war. Israel should end unlawful attacks that do not target military objectives and may be intended as collective punishment or broadly to destroy civilian property. Deliberate or reckless attacks violating the laws of war are war crimes. That sounds pretty definitive until you investigate HRW a little closer. In July 2009, the Wall Street Journal reported a delegation from Human Rights Watch was recently in Saudi Arabia to investigate the mistreatment of women under Saudi law, to campaign for the rights of homosexuals subject to death penalty in Saudi Arabia, to protest the lack of religious freedom in Saudi Kingdom, to issue a report on Saudi political prisoners. No, 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 and no. The delegation arrived to raise money from wealthy Saudis by highlighting HRW's demonization of Israel. This so-called human rights group was so proud of their anti-Israeli bent that they were willing to go to Saudi Arabia and raise money on it. Yet, the media pays attention when they accuse Israel of targeting non-military installations. They claim Israel is targeting apparent civilian structures and killing civilians in violation of laws of war. They even accuse Israel of war crimes. But Israel only targets houses containing weapons, map rooms, and command and control centers. If Israel cannot hit such houses, then it cannot fight back and would have no way to stop the ongoing missile onslaught from Hamas. The right to self-defense is an inherent human right, and any organization that denies that right should never call itself a watchdog for human rights. I'll be right back. Each week on the Hal Lindsey Report, I try to show you how today's events are bringing to life the predictions of the ancient prophets. Like a watchman on the wall, I'm warning you that time is short. Christ will soon return for his church, and I want you to be ready to go. And I want you to see how urgent it is that you make certain your family, your friends, and those around you are ready to go too. Please help me continue this work and help me take the necessary steps to broadcast the Hal Lindsey Report into more homes in America. I need your help now more than ever before.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.
A few days ago, Hamas spokesman Abu Zuhri announced all Israelis have now become legitimate targets. Well, that's hardly really a policy change, since they've been targeting all civilians from Israel for years. But with all the talk about how Israel should behave, it's instructive to look at the quote and remember that Hamas considers every Israeli, including children, to be legitimate targets. Israel has chosen another path. IDF spokesman Peter Lerner said, "We use everything at hand to try to avoid and avert civilian casualties. We phone up our enemies and tell them that we're going to blow up the building. We throw non-explosive munitions, and that is a sign they're supposed to vacate the building. Only once we have seen them vacate the building, and we are talking about command and control places, not the terrorists themselves. Then we hit. In any strategic operation, surprise is a major advantage. Can you imagine an NFL quarterback inviting the defense into his huddle so they can be informed about what play he's going to call? That's what Israel is doing in Gaza. Writing in the liberal Slate magazine, William Salatin praised the Israeli efforts to minimize civilian casualties as a possible example for future conflicts. He wrote, "The terrorist work-from-home rationale raises ugly problems for the rules of war. Israel's warning procedures, however, could become a model. You can accuse Israel of striking houses, but they're actually hitting military infrastructure that, for propaganda purposes, the enemy has placed in civilian neighborhoods. Israel first hits with a noisy, non-explosive bang on the roof, then gives plenty of time for the people to get out before sending the destructive strike. Hamas leaders head for the hills, but try to get many civilians in harm's way as they can. They can't match Israel on the battlefield, so they depend on propaganda. They create large numbers of civilian casualties that their allies in the media use as ammunition against Israel. Even former President Bill Clinton exposed their strategy. In an interview with India's NDTV, he said that the high civilian death toll was likely part of Hamas' barbaric plan. He said Hamas has a strategy designed to force Israel to kill their own civilians so that the rest of the world will condemn them. In Europe, there have been violent protests of Israel's actions in Gaza. Because of Europe's negative population growth, they have been importing laborers from the Muslim world for several years. According to the CIA fact books, Muslims now make up as much as 10% of the population of France, about 5% of the British. And that's not enough to win an election. But if you add in the usual Jew-hating fellow citizens, it's enough to stir up some enormous riots. In London, one speaker would yell, "From the river to the sea," and the crowd would respond, "Palestine will be free." They're talking about the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They're calling for the obliteration of Israel. Just another European attempt at genocidal final solution for the Jews. On MSNBC, Melissa Harris Perry interviewed a Palestinian journalist who told of traumatized children throughout Gaza. Before going to a commercial break, Harris Perry said, with apparent anger, "When I come back, I want to talk to my friend and colleague Amani Jamal about this question of the lived experience and whether or not you can justify this kind of war." After the break, Amani Jamal continued and blamed Israel for everything, but they never answered the question, can you justify this kind of war? Part of the Allied effort to win World War II was a carpet bombing of Germany. Look at the pictures of Berlin at the end of the war. Shortly before, it had been a thriving modern city. But after carpet bombing by the Allies, we see a burnt-out ruin. I've shown the pictures of Dresden before. It was totally devastated, and there were no military targets there. Carpet bombing is completely indiscriminate. It kills everything in its path. In Japan, it was even worse. On a single night, March 9, 1945, an American firebombing raid on Tokyo resulted in 100,000 deaths, more than the atomic bombs of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was not for nothing that William Tecumseh Sherman said, "War is hell." I'm not condemning the American action in bombing Tokyo and Berlin or the Allied bombing of Dresden. They had to break the will to fight on of those that they were fighting. Had they not done so, Germany and Japan would have kept fighting. Ultimately, the airmen flying those bombers were fighting for freedom, and not just for England and America, but for the whole world. Eventually, that freedom would extend to the now peaceful and highly prosperous nations of Germany and Japan. It would have been better to have avoided it entirely, but Germany and Japan started a terrible war. The violence that rained down on them was of their own making, and so it is with Hamas, except that there have been no carpet bombings or fire bombings. In Gaza, every attempt has been made to mitigate against civilian casualties, even to the point of endangering Israelis. Can you justify this kind of war? Yes. If you can justify your existence, you can justify self-defense, especially when you live in as tough a neighborhood as Israel's. You know, folks, when I wrote The Late Great Planet Earth back in 1969, there were certain prophetic themes that I knew had to happen before the Lord would come for the church and end the church age. One of the most important, of course, was that Israel, no matter how much it was attacked by its neighbors, would continue to be a strong nation, even though they would be up against ever more increasingly dangerous neighbors fighting them, trying to annihilate them. Certainly, that has continued. I believe that we see in recent developments how Israel is eventually going to have someone step in to help them, even though they've fought valiantly up until this time. Also, I talked about the fact that before the end of the church age would begin the 7-year tribulation, I said that America had to fade as a world power. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew that The United States is not predicted in any of the scenario about things that would happen just before the return of Christ. And so I, with great grief, had to predict that America would cease to be a world power and fade from being a dominant power in the last days. That's exactly what's happening right now. And I said that Russia would eventually, against its better judgment, fall into an alliance with a power that would be headed by Persia or modern Iran. We see all of that fitting together in an ever-increasing rapidity. I believe that we are about to come to that point where all of the things that were predicted as signs before Christ would return are right before us. I don't see how history can go on much longer before Christ comes for the church. And that's why I say, be ready. Make sure that right now you know that if Christ came now, that he would take you up with all the believers. If you haven't received the gift of pardon that Jesus Christ died to make free to you, then right now, just simply tell him, Lord, I'm a sinner, but right now, I receive the gift of pardon that you died to give to me. Come into my life and make my life what you want it to be. Do that right now. And God willing, I'll see you next week.